October 25, 1944, the waters off Leyte Gulf in the Philippines. It was supposed to be another day of naval operations, another day of supporting the liberation of the Philippines from Japanese occupation. The men of the United States Navy had seen plenty of action by this point in the war. They had faced conventional air attacks, submarine threats, and surface engagements. They thought they understood the nature of naval warfare in the Pacific. They were wrong. What happened that day would fundamentally change everything these sailors thought they knew about combat at sea. It would introduce a new form of warfare that defied Western military logic, challenged every assumption about human behavior in combat, and created a psychological burden that would haunt these men for the rest of their lives. The morning began like many others during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which historians would later call the largest naval battle in history. The escort carriers of Taffy 1, part of Task Unit 77.4.1, were conducting routine flight operations off Samar. These small carriers, converted from merchant hulls, were never meant to face the kind of threat they were about to encounter. Seaman First Class Robert Johnson stood on the deck of the USS Santee that morning watching the horizon. The 20-year-old from Nebraska had been in the Navy for 18 months. He had seen action at Tarawa and in the Marianas. He considered himself a veteran, someone who had learned to manage fear, to function under fire. But nothing in his training or experience had prepared him for what he was about to witness. The radar operators first noticed something unusual around 7:30 in the morning. Aircraft were approaching, but their behavior was strange. They weren't following typical attack patterns. They seemed almost erratic, purposeful in a way that didn't match conventional tactics the operators had learned to recognize. Lieutenant Commander William Brooks was in the Combat Information Center of the USS Suwannee when the reports started coming in. A career officer who had served since before the war, Brooks prided himself on his ability to read tactical situations. But as he studied the radar returns and listened to the reports from spotters, something felt fundamentally different about this attack. The first wave came in fast and low. At first, the gunners responded as they had been trained, tracking the aircraft, leading the targets, firing in controlled bursts. The 5-inch guns opened up first, followed by the 40-millimeter Bofors guns, and then the 20-millimeter Oerlikon cannons. The sky filled with tracers and bursts of flak. But these pilots weren't taking evasive action. They weren't trying to survive long enough to drop their bombs and escape. They were pointing their aircraft directly at the ships and holding that course no matter how much fire they took. Gunner's Mate Second Class Frank Martinez was manning a 40-millimeter mount on the USS Santee when he first realized what was happening. He had hit the incoming aircraft, he was sure of it. He saw pieces flying off, saw smoke trailing from the engine. But the plane didn't veer away. It didn't try to pull up or turn. It just kept coming directly at his ship. In that moment, Martinez understood. This pilot wasn't trying to drop a bomb. He was the bomb. The aircraft itself was the weapon, and the pilot had no intention of pulling away at the last moment. This was something entirely new, something that violated every rule of aerial combat as the Americans understood it. The Zero fighter, trailing flame and smoke, smashed into the Santee's flight deck at over 200 miles per hour. The impact itself was devastating, but worse was what followed. The aircraft's fuel exploded, the bomb it carried detonated, and suddenly the flight deck was an inferno. Men were thrown through the air like dolls. Others simply disappeared in the blast. Those who survived the initial impact found themselves in a hellscape of twisted metal and burning aviation fuel. Martinez was thrown against a bulkhead by the blast wave. His ears were ringing so badly he couldn't hear the screams he could see on the faces around him. Smoke choked the air. The heat was so intense he could feel his skin blistering even from yards away. And through the chaos, one thought dominated his mind. They did that on purpose. That pilot deliberately flew his plane into us. Across the formation, other ships were experiencing the same horror. The USS Suwannee took a hit that penetrated deep into the ship. The escort carrier USS St. Lo, named after a town in France, was about to face an even worse fate. Ensign Brooks Harrell was on the bridge of the St. Lo when the attack began. The 23-year-old officer from Texas had graduated from the Naval Academy just 2 years earlier. He had dreamed of commanding a ship someday. Now he was fighting for his life aboard one. The St. Lo's gunners were pouring fire into the sky. Every weapon on the ship was engaged. The noise was incredible, a continuous roar of gunfire punctuated by the scream of aircraft engines and the crump of explosions. Harrell watched as one Japanese aircraft broke through the defensive fire, trailing smoke, but still flying, still coming. The Zero crashed into the St. Lo's flight deck near the aft elevator. The impact was bad enough, but what happened next was catastrophic. The bomb the aircraft carried punched through the thin flight deck and exploded in the hangar bay below. In the confined space of the hangar, the blast was amplified. Worse, the hangar was full of armed and fueled aircraft ready for the next sortie. What followed was a chain reaction of destruction. Aircraft exploded, fuel tanks ruptured, ammunition cooked off in a continuous series of detonations. The St. Lo was being torn apart from the inside. Harrell found himself shouting orders, but he couldn't even hear his own voice over the roar of destruction. Men were running, some toward the flames with firefighting equipment, others simply trying to escape the inferno. The ship's damage control parties responded with incredible courage, running into spaces filled with fire and smoke, but the damage was too severe, too widespread. Below decks, the situation was even worse. Machinist's mate, third class. Donald Shaw was in the engine room when the attack hit. The first indication he had that something was wrong was when the entire ship shuddered like a living thing in pain. Then the order came over the sound-powered phones. Maintain steam. Maintain power. Damage control parties respond. Shaw and his crew stayed at their posts, even as reports filtered down of the devastation above. The heat in the engine room was always brutal, but now it was becoming unbearable. The ventilation system was compromised, and smoke was starting to seep in. But they kept the engines running, kept the ship moving, because that was their job, and because abandoning their posts without orders was unthinkable. It wasn't until the order to abandon ship came that Shaw realized just how bad things were. Making his way topside, he emerged into a scene from a nightmare. The entire aft section of the ship was engulfed in flames. Secondary explosions were still ripping through the hull. Men were jumping over the side into the ocean, some with life jackets, some without. Shaw made it to the side of the ship and jumped. The fall seemed to last forever. When he hit the water, the shock of it drove the air from his lungs. He surfaced, gasping, and swam away from the ship as fast as he could. Behind him, the St. Lo was dying, torn apart by internal explosions, listing heavily, taking on water. 23 minutes after the hit, the St. Lo capsized and sank. She had the grim distinction of being the first major American warship to be sunk by an intentional crash attack. Of her crew of over 800 men, more than 100 perished in the attack and the sinking. Across Taffy 1 and the other Taffy units, similar scenes were playing out. The USS Kitkun Bay, Kalinin Bay, and White Plains all came under attack. Gunners fired until their barrels were hot enough to glow, until ammunition ran low, until their ships were either hit or the attackers were driven off. What made these attacks particularly horrifying for the American sailors was not just the physical danger, though that was real enough. It was the psychological impact of facing an enemy who didn't follow any of the rules they understood. In every previous engagement, there had been an assumption that the enemy, whatever else he might be, wanted to survive. Self-preservation was a universal human instinct. It governed tactical decisions on both sides. But these pilots had abandoned self-preservation entirely. They had weaponized themselves. and that changed everything about how the sailors had to think about combat. Petty Officer James Wilson, a fire controlman on the USS Kalinin Bay, later tried to explain it to a war correspondent. You train to fight an enemy who's trying to hit you and get away. You develop tactics. You learn to predict their moves based on that assumption. But when the enemy doesn't care about getting away, when his whole mission is to make sure he doesn't get away, everything you know stops working. Wilson's ship was hit by a Zero that crashed into the port side, destroying several gun positions and starting fires. The crew fought the flames for hours. Many men performed acts of extraordinary courage that day, running into burning compartments to rescue trapped shipmates, manning guns even as their positions were strafed, working damage control until they collapsed from exhaustion. But even as they fought to save their ship, many of them were grappling with a fundamental question. What kind of military organization would order men to do this? What could possibly drive pilots to turn themselves into guided missiles? The Americans didn't know it yet, but Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi had formed the first official special attack units just days before, on October 19th. Onishi, commanding the 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines, had looked at his situation and drawn a stark conclusion. Japanese naval aviation had been devastated in recent battles. He had few experienced pilots left, limited numbers of aircraft, and was facing an enemy with overwhelming numerical and technological superiority. Conventional attacks weren't working. Even when Japanese pilots managed to hit American ships with bombs or torpedoes, the damage was often repairable. American damage control was excellent, and the industrial capacity of the United States meant that even significant losses could be replaced relatively quickly. Onishi needed a way to sink ships, not just damage them, and he needed to do it with the limited resources he had. His solution was to embrace what he saw as the ultimate expression of the warrior spirit that had been part of Japanese military culture for centuries. Pilots would load their aircraft with explosives and deliberately crash into enemy ships, focusing on aircraft carriers. The goal wasn't just to damage a ship, it was to destroy it completely, to punch through the deck and detonate inside the hull, where the blast would be most effective. Onishi had called for volunteers, and he got them. Young pilots, many barely trained, stepped forward. Some were motivated by loyalty to the emperor, others by a desire to protect Japan from invasion, still others by the warrior code of Bushido that emphasized honor and self-sacrifice. Whatever their individual motivations, they were willing to trade their lives for the chance to strike a significant blow against the enemy. The Japanese called these units shimpu, often translated as divine wind, though Westerners would come to know them by the alternate pronunciation kamikaze. Back on the American ships, as the initial shock began to fade and damage control efforts brought fires under control and stabilized damaged vessels, the sailors began to process what they had experienced. The conversations in the mess halls and on the weather decks that night had a different quality than usual post-battle discussions. Radioman Second Class Thomas Chen, a Chinese-American sailor serving on the USS Kitkun Bay, remembered the surreal quality of those conversations. Men who had been through heavy combat before, who had faced Japanese torpedo bombers at Midway or fought through the Solomons campaign, were struggling to articulate what made this different. One sailor kept repeating that it was like fighting ghosts. You couldn't scare them off because they weren't afraid to begin with. You couldn't make them break off their attack because breaking off wasn't part of their plan. You had to completely destroy the aircraft before it hit you, had to shoot well enough to either eliminate the pilot or so damage the aircraft that it couldn't fly. Near misses didn't matter. Even hits that would have sent a conventional attacker limping away didn't matter if the plane could still fly for another few seconds. The gunners particularly felt the pressure of this new reality. Aviation Ordnance Man Third Class Robert Patterson, who worked with the 40mm gun crews on the USS White Plains, noted that the margin for error had effectively disappeared. In a conventional attack, if you missed or only damaged the attacking aircraft, it might drop its weapon inaccurately or have to break off entirely. But with these new tactics, unless you stopped the plane completely, it was still a deadly threat, until it either hit something or crashed into the sea. This put enormous pressure on the gun crews. They were already working in dangerous conditions, exposed to enemy fire on open mounts, handling ammunition in the middle of explosions and chaos. Now they had to be even more accurate, even more deadly in their fire, because anything less than complete destruction of the target might not be enough. The psychological weight of this fell particularly hard on the younger sailors. Seaman Second Class Billy Henderson, just 18 years old and fresh from boot camp, was manning an ammunition hoist on the USS Santee during the attack. He had joined the Navy with ideas about heroism and adventure, shaped by newsreels and recruiting posters. The reality of combat had already stripped away much of that innocence. But this was something else entirely. Henderson later wrote to his parents that the hardest part wasn't the danger itself, though that was terrifying enough. It was the feeling that the rules had changed, that the enemy had found a way to turn human beings into weapons in a way that felt fundamentally wrong, that violated some unspoken agreement about how war was supposed to work. But even as these sailors struggled with the psychological implications, they also had to deal with the practical realities. Ships had been damaged, men had been wounded or lost, and everyone knew this wasn't going to be an isolated incident. If the Japanese had started using these tactics, they would use them again. The Navy's response began almost immediately. Intelligence officers interviewed survivors, trying to understand exactly what had happened. How had the attacks been coordinated? What were the targeting priorities? Were there patterns that could be exploited? Commander David Morrison, an intelligence officer attached to Task Force 77, spent the days after the attack compiling reports and debriefing officers and crew. What emerged was a picture of a new tactical challenge that would require new solutions. The attacks had been most effective against the escort carriers because these ships had relatively light armor and thin flight decks. The small carriers had been designed for anti-submarine warfare and ground support, not for sustained combat against determined air attack. Their defensive armament, while respectable, was less than that of the larger fleet carriers, and they had fewer aircraft to provide combat air patrol. Morrison's reports emphasized the need for increased combat air patrol coverage, better radar coordination to provide earlier warning, and more intensive anti-aircraft fire. But he also noted something that would become a recurring theme in American analysis of these attacks. The psychological resilience of the crews would be as important as any tactical adjustment. Lieutenant Samuel Goldstein, a Navy psychiatrist, was brought in to assess the mental state of sailors who had survived the attacks. What he found troubled him. Many men were experiencing what would later be recognized as symptoms of trauma. Nightmares were common. Some sailors were having difficulty sleeping, reliving the attacks over and over. Others were showing signs of anxiety when aircraft approached, even friendly ones. Goldstein recommended that men who had been through the attacks be given time to decompress when possible, that the Navy needed to take seriously the psychological impact of this new form of warfare. But in the middle of an active campaign, with the invasion of the Philippines ongoing and more operations planned, there was limited opportunity for rest and recovery. The sailors themselves developed their own coping mechanisms. Humor, dark and gallows though it might be, helped some men process the horror. Ritual and routine provided structure and normalcy. Religious faith became more important for many. Chaplains found themselves busier than ever, conducting services, providing counseling, simply being present for men who needed someone to talk to. Fireman First Class Michael O'Brien, a Catholic from Boston, had never been particularly religious before the war, but after surviving the attack on the St. Hugh, Lowe, after spending hours in the water waiting to be rescued, after watching his ship sink beneath the waves, he found himself attending Mass regularly, saying prayers he hadn't said since childhood. It wasn't about theology or doctrine, he later explained. It was about finding some framework to make sense of what he had experienced, some way to process the randomness of who lived and who died. The bonds between sailors also deepened. Men who had served together before the attack found those relationships strengthened by shared trauma. New sailors who joined damaged ships after they returned to port found themselves part of a crew that had been through something extraordinary and whose members looked out for each other with fierce loyalty. But beyond individual coping mechanisms, there was also the practical reality that the war continued. Ships needed to be repaired. New tactics needed to be developed and implemented. Training needed to be updated to reflect this new threat. The damaged ships that could be saved were sent to rear area bases for repairs. The USS Santee made it to Manus in the Admiralty Islands, where work crews began the long process of cutting away damaged sections of the flight deck, repairing structural damage, and replacing destroyed equipment. The work took weeks, and during that time, the crew had to live with the visible reminders of what they had been through. The holes torn in their ship by an enemy pilot who had deliberately flown into them. Meanwhile, intelligence officers and tactical analysts were trying to figure out how to counter this new threat. The obvious answer was to shoot down the attacking aircraft before they could hit their targets, but that was easier said than done. The special attack aircraft came in fast and low, often mixing with conventional attacks to confuse defenders. And the pilots showed a willingness to make their final dives through intense anti-aircraft fire that conventional attackers would have avoided. Several solutions began to emerge. First, better radar coordination could provide earlier warning, giving defending fighters more time to intercept. Second, increasing the density of anti-aircraft fire around potential targets could improve the chances of destroying attackers before they hit. Third, ships began to develop specific maneuvers designed to reduce the chances of a successful hit. Captain Walter Carrig, who would later write the official Navy history of these operations, interviewed numerous ship captains about their defensive tactics. What emerged was a picture of naval officers desperately innovating under pressure, trying anything that might increase their ship's chances of survival. Some captains found that radical course changes at the last moment could cause an attacking aircraft to miss, as the pilot committed to his dive couldn't adjust quickly enough. Others used smoke screens to reduce visibility and make targeting more difficult. Still others experimented with different anti-aircraft fire patterns, trying to create walls of fire that would be impossible to fly through. But all of these tactical innovations had to be balanced against the ship's primary missions. Escort carriers needed to launch and recover aircraft to support ground operations and provide fleet defense. They couldn't just maneuver evasively all day. Destroyers and other escorts had to maintain formation and be ready to respond to submarine threats. The special attack threat was serious, but it was not the only threat these ships faced. As November progressed and the Philippines campaign continued, the Japanese launched more special attacks. The American sailors were no longer surprised by the tactic, but that didn't make it any less frightening. If anything, knowing what to expect, knowing that these attacks were going to continue, created its own kind of dread. Quartermaster Second Class Eugene Matthews, serving on the destroyer USS Hazelwood, kept a diary against regulations. His entries from this period paint a vivid picture of daily life under the threat of special attacks. He wrote about the constant tension, the way every unidentified aircraft on radar caused hearts to race, the relief when combat air patrol shot down attackers before they could reach the ships, and the horror when one got through. On November 27th, the Hazelwood was hit by a special attack aircraft. Matthews was on the bridge when it happened. He saw the Zero diving through a hail of anti-aircraft fire, saw it clip the mast, and then slam into the superstructure. The bridge was wrecked. Men died instantly. Matthew survived, thrown down a ladder by the blast, suffering a broken arm and severe burns. As he was being evacuated to the sick bay, stumbling through smoke-filled passageways, he passed damage control parties running toward the fire. These men, his shipmates, were running into danger while he was running away from it, and that bothered him deeply. In his diary, once he was able to write again, he grappled with feelings of guilt, wondering if he should have stayed and helped, wondering why he survived when others on the bridge didn't. His was not an uncommon reaction. Many survivors of these attacks struggled with survivor's guilt, questioning why they lived when others died, wondering if there was something they could have done differently. The random nature of the attacks, the way a man could be fine one moment and gone the next, made it difficult to find any rational explanation for survival. The Navy's medical personnel were increasingly aware of these psychological casualties. Corpsmen and doctors treated burns and shrapnel wounds and broken bones, but they were also seeing men who were physically unhurt but psychologically devastated. The term battle fatigue was used, but it didn't quite capture what these men were experiencing. Dr. Margaret Hastings, one of the Navy nurses serving at a forward hospital on Leyte, treated many sailors evacuated from ships hit by special attacks. She noted in her reports that these men often exhibited symptoms similar to those she had seen in ground troops who had been through particularly intense combat, but with an additional element of incomprehension, a struggle to understand why the enemy would do this. One young sailor she treated, who had been blown overboard when his ship was hit and spent 6 hours in the water before being rescued, kept repeating that it didn't make sense. He couldn't understand why a pilot would throw away his life like that. Dr. Hastings tried to explain what little was known about Japanese military culture, about the concept of honor through self-sacrifice, but the sailor couldn't reconcile it with his own values and assumptions. This cultural gap would remain throughout the war. American military culture emphasized achieving mission objectives while minimizing casualties. Leaders who threw away their men's lives unnecessarily were considered incompetent or worse. The idea of deliberately planning operations where the personnel involved had no chance of survival was deeply alien. But for the Japanese military, particularly by late 1944, when the strategic situation was becoming desperate, the special attack concept made a kind of brutal logic. One pilot with a plane loaded with explosives could potentially sink a ship worth millions of dollars and crewed by hundreds of men. From a purely mathematical perspective, it was an efficient use of resources, and in a culture that had long valued honor and self-sacrifice, finding volunteers was not difficult. American sailors didn't need to understand the cultural context to have to deal with the tactical reality. As December began and the Philippines campaign continued, special attacks became a regular feature of naval operations. Ships developed protocols for dealing with attacks. Gun crews trained specifically for engaging diving aircraft. Damage control parties drilled endlessly on how to contain and fight the types of fires and flooding these attacks caused. The entire fleet was learning and adapting. Combat air patrol procedures were refined. Radar operators got better at identifying the signs of incoming special attacks. Ships began to coordinate their defensive fire more effectively, creating overlapping fields of fire that gave attackers fewer gaps to exploit. But even as tactics improved and defenses became more sophisticated, the attacks continued to take a toll. On December 13th, the destroyer USS Reed was hit by multiple aircraft in quick succession and sank with heavy casualties. On January 4, 1945, during operations at Lingayen Gulf, the escort carrier USS Amine Bay was hit so badly she had to be abandoned and scuttled. The battleship USS New Mexico took a hit on her bridge that included the ship's captain and a British observer among the casualties. For the sailors experiencing these attacks, each one reinforced the psychological burden. Chief Petty Officer Raymond Clark, a damage controlman with 20 years of service, had been through Pearl Harbor, Guadalcanal, and the Philippines campaign. He later said that nothing in his experience compared to the sustained stress of operating under the special attack threat. In conventional combat, there were moments of intense action followed by periods of relative calm. You could recover, process what had happened, prepare for the next engagement. But with special attacks, the threat was constant. Whenever ships were operating within range of Japanese airfields, whenever conditions were suitable for air operations, there was the possibility of attack. And because the attacks could come at any time, the tension never fully dissipated. This constant stress began to show in various ways. Some men became hypervigilant, jumping at sudden noises, unable to relax even when off duty. Others became fatalistic, developing a dark conviction that their ship would eventually be hit no matter what precautions were taken. Still others threw themselves into their duties with an almost manic intensity, as if staying busy enough would keep them from thinking about the danger. The officers and senior enlisted men tried to maintain morale and combat effectiveness even as they dealt with their own fears and stress. Commander Richard Evans, executive officer of the escort carrier USS Natoma Bay, made it a point to walk the ship every day, talking with sailors, checking on their well-being, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy and routine, even in abnormal circumstances. Evans understood that his crew was looking to the officers for cues on how to react. If the leadership seemed panicked or demoralized, it would spread through the entire ship. So he and the other officers worked hard to project confidence and competence, even when they were privately terrified of the next attack. This was particularly important for the younger, less experienced sailors. Seaman Robert Taylor, who had joined the Natoma Bay's crew in December after the ship's initial combat damage was repaired, found reassurance in the calm competence of the veteran sailors and officers around him. They had been through attacks before and survived. If they could handle it, maybe he could too. But even the veterans had limits. By January of 1945, as the campaign moved toward Luzon, the strain was showing on everyone. Medical officers were reporting increasing cases of what they termed combat fatigue. Men were making mistakes from exhaustion and stress. The Navy began to rotate ships and crews out of the combat zone when possible, giving them time to rest and recover before returning to operations. The special attacks reached a peak during the Okinawa campaign in the spring of 1945. By then, the tactics had been refined on both sides. The Japanese were launching larger, more coordinated attacks. The Americans had improved their defenses and had more ships, more aircraft, more anti-aircraft guns, but the attacks kept coming. Sailors who had survived the first special attacks in October of '44, who had thought that experience was the worst thing they would face, found themselves going through it again and again. The cumulative psychological toll was enormous. Some men reached their breaking point. Others found reserves of strength they didn't know they had. Looking back, the survivors of those first attacks in October had witnessed the beginning of a new and terrible chapter in naval warfare. They had been the first to face an enemy who had weaponized themselves, who had turned the most fundamental human instinct, self-preservation, on its head in service of military necessity. The reactions of those sailors, that mix of shock, horror, incomprehension, and determination, would be echoed by thousands more as the special attacks continued through the final months of the war. They would face it with courage and resilience, with innovation and adaptation, with humor and faith, and stubborn refusal to give up. The escort carrier sailors of Taffy 1 on October 25, 1944, the men on the Santee and Suwannee, and particularly the St. Lo, had been the first. They had no warning, no preparation, no idea what they were about to face. They reacted as best they could, fighting their ships, saving their shipmates, and in the case of the Saint, Lo's crew facing the terrible reality of watching their ship die beneath them. In the years after the war, many of these veterans struggled to talk about their experiences. How do you explain to someone who wasn't there what it was like to see an aircraft deliberately fly into your ship? How do you convey the terror, the incomprehension, the way it challenged every assumption about what war was supposed to be? Some never spoke of it at all, carrying their memories in silence. Others found community with their fellow survivors, men who had shared the experience and didn't need it explained. Veterans organizations and reunions became important spaces where these men could be understood without having to articulate the inarticulable. The special attacks would eventually claim dozens of American ships and thousands of American lives. The psychological impact would affect tens of thousands more. But in the final accounting, the tactic didn't change the course of the war. American industrial might, numerical superiority, and the skill and resilience of sailors who learned to adapt and overcome new challenges would prevail. The men who faced that first attack wave on October 25, 1944, couldn't know how the war would end. All they knew was that they had survived something terrible, that they had seen warfare transformed in a way that would haunt them forever. They had stood at their posts, done their jobs, saved their ships when possible, and endured when saving wasn't possible. Their reactions that day, their shock and fear and determination, their courage in the face of a new horror, represented the best qualities of the American sailor: adaptability, resilience, and an unwillingness to quit no matter how bad things got. They had faced the unthinkable and found ways to cope, to fight back, to survive. In the decades that followed, as historians studied the special attack campaign and analyzed its effectiveness, the focus was often on statistics, on ships sunk and damaged, on tactical innovations and strategic implications. But the real story was always about the men, about sailors like Robert Johnson and Frank Martinez and Brooks Harrell and all the others who experienced those attacks and had to find ways to continue functioning, to keep doing their jobs, to maintain their humanity in the face of a tactic that seemed to deny humanity itself. They were ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances. They were sailors doing a job that had suddenly become infinitely more dangerous and psychologically demanding. They were sons and brothers and fathers, young men and veterans, scared and brave in equal measure. And on October 25, 1944, they became the first American sailors to face the divine wind, the Kamikaze, and to begin figuring out how to survive it. Their experiences, their reactions, their courage, and their fears would set the pattern for all who would follow, for all who would face that same terrible threat in the months to come. The legacy of that day lives on in the memories of survivors, in the historical record, in the lessons learned about naval warfare and human resilience. It stands as a testament to what people can endure when they have no choice but to endure, to what they can overcome when giving up is not an option. These American sailors who reacted to the first special attack wave with shock and determination, with fear and courage, deserve to be remembered not just for what they survived, but for how they survived it, with honor, with resilience, and with an unbreakable will to see the mission through, no matter the cost.